Sarnation woke up to the sound of birds chirping and the smell of a campfire entering his nostrils. He opened his eyes. He laid beside a campfire, the humans gathered around that same campfire. He got upright. He noticed a large cut on his forearm, which had already been bandaged. He didn't even notice when he was fighting the ghouls. "Good morning," he said, as he tried to take in the scene with his still blurry vision. "Ah, you're awake," one of the humans said. "Want some bread? Maybe some water?" he proceeded to ask. "Sounds good," Sarnation answered. The human handed him a piece of bread and a canteen full of water. Sarnation took a sip and then a bite of the loaf of bread. "You saved me there, you know," the human said. "I guess, although survival instincts alone were enough to motivate me." Sarnation responded as he took another sip out of the canteen. "Still, I just wanted to thank you," the human said. "You're welcome, I guess," Sarnation said as he took another bite of the loaf of bread. The human took off his helmet to reveal a pale man with green-colored eyes and fiery red hair. "I owe you a favor. If you ever want to call on it, just tell me. Name's Daniel Smith," he told the elf. "I'll remember, Daniel," Sarnation said as he looked the human in the eyes. "If you two are done bonding, we can resume our march." Darius approached, followed by the remaining two human soldiers. "Right. Will you allow me to get put on something more appropriate?" Sarnation asked Darius, who nodded in response. After putting on his gambeson, boots, cloak, amulet, and changing his socks, the elf was ready to go. "How long until we arrive?" Sarnation asked the humans. "Another 5 or so hours until we reach camp. There we can get out of this godforsaken swamp," Darius answered. "Hopefully we won't be attacked by ghouls again." "It was unusual," Sarnation said in response. "What was?" Darius asked. "The ghouls, they usually prey on the sick, dead, and dying. It's how to procreate," Sarnation answered. "How do ghouls procreate?" Darius asked in return. "Undead procreate by taking corpses with Ternitia in them and putting them in cursed or magical grounds," Sarnation answered. "Though there are varieties, burned are usually mages who are burned, as the name might imply." "Any other kinds?" Darius asked. "Well, you have drowned, which are corpses who have drowned in magical waters, bloodsuckers who are exceptional mages that underwent the ghoulification process," Sarnation explained. "And a lot more. Frankly, I'm surprised. You appear to be a knowledgeable man, and yet you lack knowledge of the Magvi and Bogvi. So why do you think they attacked us?" Darius asked Sarnation. "If only I could answer that question for that." Sarnation said, "Even the most predictable Magvi have cases that form an exception, and ghouls are all but the most predictable Magvi," he answered. "What you're saying is that we don't know," Darius said somberly, "and that this could happen again." "That's one way to interpret it, yes," Sarnation answered. "If we had more time, we could use the intestines of an animal and a few herbs to make distractions for the ghouls. Throw them off. Sadly, we don't have that time." Sarnation said, "Moving fast is the best solution to the predicament we're currently in." "Sounds like a plan at the very least," Darius said as he increased the pace. "Still curious as to why we don't just get a truck or a helicopters or something like that." One of the soldiers said, "Not Daniel." No, it was a notably more feminine voice, although that was difficult to tell through the filter the human's helmet applied. "You notice the landscape we're in. Any truck would get stuck in the mud." The other human soldier responded. This one had a coarse, harsh voice. "Doesn't rule out helicopters," the feminine voice said one more. "Pretty sure the diplomats fucked up and the High King denied us passage through his lands. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to be arrested and then executed," the coarse voice said back. "Still better than them finding our corpses being eaten by undead," the feminine voice snapped back. "And worse than escaping unseen and unharmed," the coarse voice argued back. "Quit arguing and start marching faster," Darius yelled out. Approximately 5 hours later, Sarnation eyes scanned the human camp. There were dozens of humans everywhere doing dozens of tasks. Each and every one of was unlike the average peasant, however. Most of them were literate, even stranger. They all seemed strangely young, well-fed, and none of them were ill. Most armies, when on march, were malnourished and sick, with the exception of knights, men-at-arms, and sorcerers. But those were the exception, not the rule. "Done staring?" Darius asked. "Think so," Sarnation said. "Where are we going?" he asked. "Since we're officially out of Orcish territory, a helicopter is coming to pick us up," Darius responded. "You never explained to me what a helicopter is," Sarnation said. Then he heard a loud wind-like sound surround him. Sarnation was startled by the noise and looked up to look at the thing causing the sound. "I assume that's a helicopter?" he asked. Darius nodded. "That would be a good assumption," he responded. "You sure that's safe?" Sarnation asked back. "Safer than going by foot, I can tell you that much," Darius answered. "I guess I've got no choice but to believe you," Sarnation said as the helico in a designated area. The noise stopped. Darius and his squad approached the helicopter. Sarnation meekly followed. "Strap yourself in," Darius said as he entered the vehicle and strapped himself in. Sarnation looked at the straps in confusion. He looked at the others and copied what they were doing. One of the soldiers noticed this and aided him in strapping himself down. "So where are we heading?" Sarnation asked. "Gruntharn," Darius responded. "The Ammonic Castle?" Sarnation looked at the human in confusion. "The Ammonic Castle, yes," he responded. "Interesting. You managed to conquer the Ammoni?" Sarnation asked. "I apologize for my ignorance. I've been away for far too long." "Not exactly," Darius responded. "Somehow a massive portal opened between this continent and my own continent. We're not some otherworldly invasion force." That was what the world of Narravor would know as the truth. After all, much of their world was still unknown. Magic, although powerful, was rare and was only taught to the elite. "So how did you come to possess Gruntharn?" Sarnatian asked. "Well, after the portal opened in front of the dwarven fortress of Halamund, we first sent a scouting force and then a small diplomatic envoy," Darius said. "The fortress of Halamund? The same fortress which is manned by fanatics so zealous they kill everything in a 500-meter radius of it?" Sarnation said in disbelief. "If only we had that knowledge at that time. 2 of our diplomats were killed before we could evacuate," Darius explained. "And then what?" Sarnation asked. "We took Halamund in one night, after which we invited emissaries from all nations. The Imperium still didn't see us as an actual nation. The orcs were too busy killing each other because another one of their civil wars was going on. I don't think any nation south to the Imperium even got the invitations, and the Ammoni were the only ones that actually showed up," Darius said. Sarnation's eyes grew larger while hearing that. The fortress of Halamund taken within a single night? If he hadn't witnessed what the humans had been capable of during their little battle with the ghouls, he wouldn't have believed the man. On the topic of human capabilities, the elf still didn't understand how any of this was possible. He was hundreds of meters up in the air, in a vehicle without any magic powering it. Had these humans managed to decipher the laws of nature without the help of the divine, infernal, or magical? That couldn't possibly be. "What happened to the dwarves? Did they try to destroy you?" "They tend to do that to invaders," Sarnation asked, still in shock of how easily the seemingly impregnable fortress was taken. "They just ignored us. I think they were intimidated." Darius said, "I digress. The Ammoni offered us the castle of Gruntharn as a permanent embassy. In exchange, we would set up a trade network with them and try to preserve the shaky peace between them and the Imperium." "A deal with devils," Sarnation said. "I don't actually think they are that bad." Darius said, "They may have a bit of an obsession with animal sacrifices, blood magic and raiding, but truth be told, so do the orcs, as do the Imperium, the dwarves, and basically everyone else. When pressed to choose 2 evils, I'd choose neither," Sarnation said with a firm voice. "Let's just forget you joined the orcs after you were banished for noticing the malice of the Imperium," Darius remarked. "I didn't join the orcs. I helped a village rebuild and improved the lives of dozens," Sarnation snapped back. "Still, the Ammoni are overly ambitious, greedy and curious, but not out to ritually sacrifice thousands, unlike some other nations." Darius said, "We're almost at Gruntharn," the soldier with the coarse voice said. "Excellent," Darius replied. After the landing in a designated area, Sarnation looked over at the castle. The walls were manned by human soldiers, Indeed, guards were everywhere. Then there were the beast folk. There were dozens of them. He was escorted to the entrance of a particularly luxurious-looking building. There were dozens of iron boxes mounted on wheels lined up around the building, and human personnel were all around the place. Some were hitting the iron boxes with steel tools. Strange iron contraptions were cleaning the place up. In front of the building were 2 guards. These ones, however, wore lighter armor. There were barrels, full of something all around the place. Each one had a little image of a flame drawn on them. If Sarnation could pause time, he would have been there for hours, if not days, trying to figure out everything. Sadly, he couldn't. Word of warning before we enter, you're supposed to sign quite a few things I can Darius said to Sarnation. Sure, give me a quill and the papers. Sarnation said. Darius looked at the elf in surprise. I said I'd uphold my end of the bargain, and my honor is one of the few things I have left. Very well. Still, I advise you to read them. Darius said. I will. Sarnation simply responded. The first of the papers was an agreement to not disclose his reason for being here, that was to eventually overthrow the Imperium to any non-human personnel at a non-designated meeting spot. The second was a list of several rules, punishments, and guidelines. All of them seemed quite reasonable to Sarnation. After reading through them, he signed both of them. That should do it, he said after he had signed the papers. That does do it, Darius responded, and handed Sarnation a pair of keys. If anyone not authorized to know the truth asks who you are and what you're doing here, tell them you're a hired servant called Kuranon, known for your excellent dictionaries. Strange story, but I understand it. It's a good explanation as to why I can read, Sarnation said as he took the keys. I assume these are for my room? He asked. Yes, due to an unforeseen diplomatic encounter, the lieutenant who was supposed to take you to your room has been delayed, Darius said. I suppose I'll just have to wait then, Sarnation said. A massive, hulking mass of fur, muscle, and horns approached the gates of the castle of Gruntharn. Behind them there were all kinds of fantastical creatures. Tracurius had informed the human diplomats of the beast folk, and although they were reasonably prepared, it was still awe-inspiring to see it in the flesh. Most of the beast folk looked exhausted, or at the very least, downtrodden. Maybe it was because of the rainy weather and gray sky, or perhaps it was because of the intimidating and utilitarian soldiers that manned the walls of the castle they were approaching. Who truly knew? They're a day too late, Tracurius commented. Why are they traveling together? Romano asked. Because they want to ask you something together, Tracurius answered. What's that supposed to mean? Patricia approached and asked Tracurius. The Khat were enslaved and conquered by the Imperium. The Arismer have been raiding the Imperium, and the Surai probably just want to prevent a potential invasion, Tracurius responded. Why not just band together and attack the Imperium? Pretty sure that would annihilate it considering the condition of it, Romano said. They have been a part of the Imperium for thousands of years now. They rely on Imperial sorcerers to maintain their once lush and now depleted fields. Tracurius explained, the Arismer are divided into nomadic and coastal Arismer, and only the latter raids the Imperium as they don't share a direct border. What about the lizards, the Surai? Romano asked. The Surai. Their jungle homeland is infested with demons. They're mostly neutral and aloof, so they probably just want a truce, Tracurius said. Sir, they're asking permission to enter, a soldier said to Romano. Thank God we already know their language, and they aren't entering with an army accompanying them. Romano said, Say they're welcome to enter with a small escort. Yes, sir, the soldier said, as he pressed a button on his helmet. Anything else you decided to not tell us? Patricia asked Tracurius. No, just know that they're most likely after the dissolution of the Imperium, Tracurius responded. Then let's greet our guests, Romano said as he signed 4 soldiers to escort them downstairs. As they walked down the stairs, rain slowly started pouring down from the sky. Amongst the soldiers, there was an aura of anxiety and depression. The same was true for the beast folk, for when Tracurius and the humans accompanying him spotted the beasts, there was a sense of downtroddenness dripping from them. Although Tracurius wasn't an expert when it came to reading the faces of beast folk, He could make out that these people were incredibly nervous. He would be as well, the towering walls, the massive masses of iron guarding the walls, and the gray weather made for an intimidating combination. I am Diplomat Sardinjan of the Khat people, and the leading representative of the Parazet, the League of Free People. One of the felines said to say that Khat resembled humans and elves would be a downright lie. They more so resembled beasts, not people, and if one were not told they were sapient, people would no doubt mistake them for exotic beasts. Despite this fact, before the invasion of Ryman, the Khat had built quite an impressive civilization. The Khat constructed pyramids of the various kinds of stones they could find, and upon these pyramids offered up animals, grain, and jewelry in exchange for magical swords, shields, the bestowment of arcane powers upon certain individuals, and prosperity. That last fact was what drove Ryman, conqueror and uniter of the elves, to try and occupy the Khat homeland, Trevar. It was during this time that Ryman ascended to godhood and fought the Khat gods. 3 years later, and the Khat gods lay dead. With the Khat gods dead or banished, Trevar went from a lush and fertile land to one only held intact by the Imperial College of Ratazat, one of the magical colleges of the Imperium, which, like many others, is also currently allied with Neastos. Salutations, Sir Sardinjan. I am pleased to make your acquaintance. I'm Ambassador Patricia Williams, Patricia said as she bowed, as was tradition for the Khat. From behind the Khat diplomat came a hulking frame of pure muscle and fur, a arismer, if Tricurius had to guess. Indeed, the smell alone was enough to confirm his suspicions. The giant smelled like sea salt, rotten fish, and urine. Most likely a coastal arismer, the nomadic variant usually didn't involve themselves in the affairs of other nations. The coastal arismer, however, were ferocious warriors and pirates. They pillaged the shores of the Imperium for slaves, which they then sold back to the Imperium for a lower price. I am Uyanum, the giant said with a deep, bellowing voice. Pleased to meet you, Uyanum, Patricia said as he inspected the large man. Without anyone realizing it, the Surai ambassador had somehow maybe their way to the front. Judging by the softer facial features and only 2 eyes instead of 4, it was most likely a female. Greetings, Ambassador. I'm Yorenzia, emissary of the Bulzhek, Fulhijek, and Kenhern, she said as she made a low bow. Patricia returned the gesture. Greetings to you as well, emissary Yorenzia, she said. Now that we've properly made ourselves acquaintance, I assume the reason you've come here is to attend the negotiations for a peace between the various nations of Narravor and the Imperium, as well as a potential truce and trade agreement between the nations of Narravor and the ULE, she said. The Khat ambassador nodded. That is why most of us are here. Are we hereby officially invited to these negotiations? He asked. You are. However, you are on our land, and your actions are from now on ours to judge, Patricia said, as he made Carlson give her sheets of paper with the agreements everyone had signed earlier on them. These are contracts detailing the various laws, punishments, and customs you must follow while staying in Grundtharn. You may, of course, choose to reside elsewhere. Patricia said, Please read through this thoroughly and sign it whenever you are ready. The diplomats nodded, and Patricia handed them the papers and pens. The contracts had been translated into each diplomat's native language so they could read it. Or at least, that was the idea. The Arismer diplomat was apparently illiterate, to the dismay of Patricia, who had Carlson read it out loud to make the situation even worse. The fool decided to not sign the contract and chose to reside outside of the city. Afterwards, various human personnel escorted the diplomats to their chambers. Tricurius, in the meantime, went to his own room. There he got one of his guards to get him a cup of tea and started reading up on Neastos and reports from the capital city. The potential usurper had also arrived, and after finishing his reading session, Tricurius went to visit the man. He had never met Sarnation, only heard of him. According to his family, he was a hot-headed fool. For some reason, however, Tricurius doubted that. He walked through the hallways alone for a change. Sure, the risk of being murdered was higher, but he couldn't risk anyone, even his bodyguards, finding out about Sarnation's plans. Tricurius stood outside the door and knocked. This was to be an interesting conversation. "Come in," a voice inside said. Tricurius did as asked and entered the room. It was an empty room. Maybe it was due to Narration just recently arriving, or perhaps it was due to the humans cutting costs, although with their wealth the latter was unlikely. The walls were a hue of white, with two massive windows looking out on the courtyard. There were 3 plants in the room, and the floor was made of dark brown wooden planks. The architectural style looked surreal, fantastical, and foreign, and it was. Interestingly enough, despite the cold weather outside, the rooms within the human embassy were warm and comfortable. Tricurius suspected that another one of their contraptions was at work. In the middle of the room sat Narration, a book in his left hand and a cup of a warm brown substance in his right. The man looked to be around 80 or 30 by the standards of most races. He had blonde hair that reached to his shoulders and bright purple eyes. Unlike most elves, he had a pale complexion. The latter was most likely due to his time spent in Valand, where the sun did not shine as brightly. This was contrasted by Tricurius's tanned skin, darker eyes, and rare brown hair. To Tricurius's surprise, Narration was both taller and larger than him, making him an intimidating figure. "I presume you're Tricurius?" Narration asked, as he put his book on the table in front of him. "That would be correct," Tricurius responded. "Excellent," Narration said. He smiled as he stood up and made a low bow. Tricurius returned the gesture and sat down, as did Narration. "So, will you aid in usurping the throne from the false ruler Neastos?" Tricurius asked. "I will, although I have a few questions about the political situation," Narration said as he took another sip of the brown beverage. "Go ahead," Tricurius said. Narration nodded. "First of all, Neastos, he controls the colleges of magic, if I'm correct?" he asked. "Yes, Neastos isn't particularly strong or gifted in magic, but he is great at utilizing opportunities and thrives in chaos. He's persuasive enough to get most of the sorcerers on his side. That should tell you enough," Tricurius responded. "So, hypothetically, if that would be removed from him, what would he have left?" Narration asked. "A legion of loyal lords, governors, and soldiers." Tricurius responded. "Have you ever met him?" he asked. "Unfortunately, yes," Narration responded. "Unfortunately?" Tricurius looked at the man quizzically. "He's the reason I decided that imperial politics weren't for me. Around 40 years ago, when I was young and naive, I genuinely believed the Imperium maintained order and stability. It sacrificed unnecessary freedoms for the good of thousands," Narration said. "That changed when one day I was tasked with visiting the despot's estate. I talked with him a bit, and that's when the seeds of doubt began to appear in my head." Narration explained. "What is that supposed to mean?" Tricurius asked. "He treated his underlings like pawns. He believed that the greatest would eventually win, that the most intelligent and the most capable would eventually triumph, that the stability we were currently experiencing was soon to be overthrown as the more competent started to demand power and influence," Narration said. "I can't say I disagree with him. Look at the Imperium now," Narration said, before Tricurius could retort. However, he continued. "And yet I doubt he truly realized the importance of what he told me. He forgot that his ideal civilization was one that could collapse in on itself at any moment," Narration said. "So why didn't you do anything before?" Tricurius asked the other elf. "You didn't let me finish," Narration responded. "After I returned back to Reimstadt after that conversation, I started to pick up on the incompetence that plagued the management and governing of the capital. You were one of the princes of the Imperium. You could have done something. You could have acted against the incompetence and the instability the Imperium faced and was about to face." Tricurius said. He took a deep breath in and recomposed himself. "My apologies. I shouldn't—" Before the younger man could finish his sentence, Narration interrupted him. "Why do you think I went to the cursed province that is Valand?" he asked Tricurius. "Anyways, after I noticed that I petitioned my father to act, to reform the governing of the Imperium and start an anti-corruption campaign, I however forgot that he got his power due to those incompetent and corrupt governors, dukes, and despots," he explained. "And so you were exiled," Tricurius concluded. "No, I was ordered to be killed. Sarnation corrected him. It's one of those few moments I'll never forget. It was midnight. I was about to go to bed after finishing Fafnir's dwarven pantheons and gods, he said. Suddenly, I heard footsteps outside of my room and the clanking of armor, swords, shields, and spears. That's when I knew it was time to leave. I suspected something like that might happen. I simply didn't expect it to happen so soon. Sarnation said, I opened the window and used a spell I had prepared for that very occasion to slow my fall. I left that cursed estate with 300 Renari, my Valtorn kin, and the clothes on my back. A few seconds later, and the damned soldiers entered. I still vividly remember it, the sound of arrows landing hairs away from me, of soldiers running after me and myself panting and trying to cast spells which tore apart the soldiers, the sickening sound of people being boiled alive within their armor, and the relief I felt when I managed to steal a horse and flee away successfully. Sarnation said as his expression turned from stern to sour, sad even. So why flee to Valand? Tricurius asked with a hint of sympathy in his voice. Why not organize a resistance group, or enact vengeance? Tricurius asked. Vengeance wouldn't do anyone any good, Sarnation retorted. If I decided to overthrow the imperial government without the aid of a larger, powerful force, even if I was successful, the Imperium would collapse into chaos, Sarnation said. I understand what Nyastos is trying to do. He's trying to establish a meritocracy. And yet he forgets that a nation as large and as rooted in tradition as the Imperium cannot be changed without great effort and time. The former, although certainly a challenge for him, is something he can most likely overcome. The latter, however. Sarnation took a deep breath in. If Nyastos wins, which is quite probable, there will be dozens of lords and governors vying for power in Nyastos's newly established dominion, probably even against his new system. His system would require time and the blood, sweat, and tears of thousands to flourish, time which isn't available. Before Nyastos can truly establish his new imperium, it will be overthrown by a dozen warlords, Sarnation said as he exhaled. Who is to say the same won't happen if I try to usurp the throne? Who says any lord will obey me? Sarnation asked Tricurius. That's what I'm curious about. I don't think you've noticed. Tricurius remarked, Have you seen what the humans are capable of? If you'd take charge with human support, you'd have a whole race with the power of a new form of magic backing you, he said. Have you seen their soldiers, all clad in magically enhanced full-plate armor? Tricurius asked Sarnation. Normally that would be a financial and logistical nightmare, and yet they handle it with apparent ease. These people aren't just brutes who happen to have invented a new form of magic. They possess their own civilization. One so radically different due to this strange new form of magicless magic. It's intimidating enough not just militarily, but also economically to make sure the lords of the Imperium submit permanently, Tricurius explained. That's why I think that if you decide to usurp the throne, it will be different. A cold breeze swept through the air and the trees as Patricia looked out of her office's window and into the castle's courtyard. Former courtyard would be a more fitting description. It had been turned into a part garage and part supply depot. Dozens of vehicles and makeshift tents lined the place. She felt bad for the poor logistics officer tasked with supplying the outpost. Dozens of new species, every single one of them needing different bedrooms, some needing different food, and even some requiring a special narcotic to stay alive. It was a nightmare to supply the place truly. And yet every single day a convoy of supply vehicles, escorted by APCs and armored drones, went through the portal and ensured none would lack anything. Most of the ambassadors of the other species would call it mundane and to be expected, but to her, more so than the guns, soldiers, and vehicles, it displayed power. See, most of the nations of this continent weren't aware that they weren't just supplying hundreds of human personnel and dozens of foreign ambassadors. They were also supplying advanced components, hyperfuel, food, and tools for maintenance. The cherry on top was that the nearest supply depot was located on the moon, hundreds of thousands of miles away. The nations of Naravor were privy to witness only a fraction of the ULE's power. They saw humanity at only its worst. She turned around to face her desk. The nations of Narravor saw a weak humanity. One that was being hamstrung by politics and logistics, however. Should they attack now, they would be decimated. The Earthbound Party might be isolationist, but they're also fiercely nationalistic. The problem was that the second would only be a benefit if they were attacked first. Then there was the FHC. It was a coalition of post-neoliberal moderates, neo-greens, and all sorts of other centrists and moderates. The FHC was mostly in favor of the Narravor expedition, but they were reluctant to send any military hardware her way and were keen on peaceful exploration, no matter how imminent a threat looked. The last major political force was the left. The left was a ragtag group of everything from neo-democratic socialists to full-on revised Marxist-Leninists. They were mostly neutral on the Narravor question and abstained from voting most of the time, perhaps trying to avoid alienating some of their voters. She looked at the pile of documents on her desk and let out a sigh. She had looked out of her window enough. Back to work. Most of the documents were relatively unimportant. They had already been sorted by one of her aides, and the truly important ones had been taken to her directly. What was left was a pile of complaints, requests, and pleas. She took one document from the pile, a complaint from one of the Orcish ambassadors. She tossed it away. Underneath the Orcish complaint there was a veritable mountain of books. The first book had a note attached to it. Comprehensive Guide to Narravor, Tracurius, it read. How hadn't this been taken to her earlier? She removed the note and took in the old dusty book. It had a brown leather cover with beautifully engraved letters on the front and back of it. Time had cast a shallow layer of dust upon it. It looked like something you'd find in a hollow film about Earth's Middle Ages. Judging from the title and the first page, she deduced it was an imperial introduction to theology. Although interesting, she didn't have time to read it. She did, however, assign an administrative officer to digitize the tome and write a shorter report about. She took a look at the other books. One was about philosophy, yet another was on statecraft. She quickly skimmed through books when an interesting name appeared in the one on statecraft. Niastos. Of course, Niastos wasn't an all that uncommon name in the Imperium. However, the longer she kept reading, the more she recognized the similarities. The way Niastos's career was described was identical to how Tracurius described it. For a long time she had tried to garner information on him, bribe his personal guard, send in spies, use drones to monitor the area, and yet very little was revealed about him. His personal guard seemed to view him as a god. Spies weren't able to get close, and drones and bugs were usually destroyed by magical means. She was doubtful Niastos knew what a bug was, but he was somewhat paranoid and would order everyone close to him to magically and thoroughly cleanse themselves and any objects close to them. Besides, the lack of proper logistics ruled out using truly high-tech stuff. She continued reading. The book spoke about his legendary ascension to being Archmagister of the Imperium, how he was a shining example of purity and zeal, and how all other magisters should aspire to be like him. There was not a word about his ambition, in fact. He was even described as humble and easily content. Beyond that, however, another notable thing caught her eye. He was an exceptional artificer. Not a sorcerer or magician. No, he had no real magical talent. Instead, he was an artificer gifted in what the book called expanse temporal magics, using purified Ternitia and somehow writing it into steel using dwarven techniques. Apparently, he was so talented that he could tear the fabric of Narravor itself. The implications were massive. An artificer which possessed such talent that he could create tears in reality, much like the portal, she realized. That could prove to be a challenge, she thought as she closed the book. She quickly began writing an L-mail to the administrative division to digitize the document, in order to preserve it and ensure it would be read by any and all important people. Niastos, Reimstadt, the jewel of the Imperium, the beating heart of Ryman's empire, the seat of emperors, it was his. Its towering walls, now his. The palace where the Imperial had resided for thousands of years was now also his. There had been many civil wars, usurpation attempts and uprisings in the history of the Imperium, and yet none of them had seen someone who was not in some way, shape, or form a descendant of Ryman on the throne. "The carriage is ready, my liege," one of his knights said as he made a respectful bow. "Good," Nyastos replied. He turned to see his foremost marshal. "How's the army doing?" he asked. "The First Corps sustained heavy casualties due to the sorcerers having issues along that side of the wall. Both the Second and Third Corps are almost at full strength, my liege," he replied. Nyastos stepped in the carriage. He gestured to both the marshal and knight to follow. The carriage itself was a work of art. Its inside was gilded with gold and decorated lavishly. It was, however, also practical. Magical runes protected the construct from magical and physical attacks. To attack it, you'd need dozens of well-trained sorcerers combined with at least a score of knights. He looked out of the carriage windows. The sorcerers had made breaches in the wall at several points in the wall. Bricks and stone littered the streets. There was a feeling of sadness. Mothers were weeping in front of the corpses of their children, and children were screaming for their parents, the usual post-siege events. Not that the frequency of it made it any better. He thought of it as a necessary evil. If the people that perished had not died, then they might have produced goods, joined his army, or been a general boon to the nation. If possible, he always avoided bloodshed. Violence kills, burns, and destroys that which he could potentially use. Besides, his army killing and destroying people and things tended to make people rebellious and unhappy with his rule. The outskirts of the city were by far the poorest. Houses were made out of unenchanted concrete. Occasionally the work of magical artists could be seen. Their frescoes decorated the otherwise sad buildings. Shady stores and bars, made out of rotting wood and qualitatively bad clay, lined the streets and produced a sort of atmosphere that no other city could mimic. It was an atmosphere of hope, and yet also one of poverty and disorder. They traveled further into the city, into the older districts. You could see exactly when certain houses were built if you looked closely. The houses here were made of mud brick and concrete. Some had only 2 stories, while others could have up to 5. Arches that were only used in the Zadian period. This was clearly the Zaerte district, infamous for its large markets. Indeed, a bit later, the street led to a large square. In the middle of the square there was a statue of Zadius, sword in hand. Eventually they neared the old city, the city Ryman built and lived in. Dozens of statues of the elven hero dotted the road. The houses here were constructed of magically enhanced marble and richly decorated with flower motifs. Pots with ever-blooming flowers adorned the gravel pathways to the houses. These were the residences of the Imperium's wealthy and powerful. He could see Ryman's temple from here, a testament to the Imperium's power. It was the largest temple constructed in all of Naravor. He visited it a few times as a child. A loud chanting could be heard. It did not sound favorable to him, as was to be expected. He was the antithesis of what the imperial cult desired. He was not of royal blood, nor was he blessed by the cult's patriarch. If there was one group he expected to hate him, it would be the cult. He wasn't worried for now, though. His most trusted marshal had secured the streets beforehand, enforcing a strict code of military law. Although he did mentally note that he should deal with them sometime, lest it be too late to do so. Eventually they reached the palace. It was magnificent. The garden in front of the palace was beautiful. Richly decorated fountains spewed water. Magnificent flowers from all around Naravor adorned the place, and statues of emperors of yore lined the pathways. The carriage halted. He stood up and exited the construct, breathing in the fresh air, the air of the Imperium's jewel, the air of his conquest, his achievement. A soldier near the door made a respectful bow and opened it as he neared. He stepped inside. He was greeted by a gigantic hall. Portraits of all the former emperors adorned the wall. Pots with flowers and various sorts of small trees were placed in between the portraits. The floor was made of marble tiles. At the beginning and the end of the hallway, magnificent marble pillars held up the roof. The pillars were wonderfully decorated, engraved with various flower motifs and made by expert craftsmen. As he progressed through the palace, its splendor did not lessen. Instead, it became all the more magnificent. Structures were held up using magic. Carpets made out of the wool of the fantastical Gilphia. Furniture made out of leather from wyverns and gilded with silver and gold. Truly it was an example of extravagance beyond compare. And it was his. He looked upon the throne of the Imperium, now his. There was no phony ruler for him to bow to, no corrupt and incompetent fool there for him to praise. Instead, it was empty. My liege. He turned around to find one of his more talented scholars bowing. He looked upon the scholar's face. It was a bronze hue. His eyes, however, were a bright purple, conflicting with his pitch-black hair. His eyebrows were particularly pronounced, and his cheekbones particularly high. He nodded. Yes, speak, he muttered. My liege, I am joyful to tell you that the Torn's eye has been moved into one of the imperial libraries. The scholar said, We have sent 50 guards to ensure it is secure. The scholar added. Again, Nyastos nodded. He gestured to the scholar to follow. Then, let us go to said library at once.